Good morning. My name is Scott Simmons. I'm the pastor here at Faith United Church of Christ, and we like to start off each service by saying that no matter where you are on life's journey, you are welcomed in this space. So whether you vote Democrat or Republican, whether you're gay or straight, new to church or been going to church your whole life, you are welcomed in this place. A couple things to share with you today. We have a trunk or treat that we're going to do on October 30th. It's on a Friday night. You'll be hearing more about that. It'll be a safe place for kids to get candy and to dress up. We're going to socially distance and do all that. So if you'd like to donate candy, you can bring it by the church between 9 and 1, Monday through Thursday. Those are our office hours when Ryan is here, or just drop it off by the front door. We will find it. And if you'd like to participate, just look for my weekly emails. There'll be some ways to volunteer through that. I want to thank all of you who have participated in the small church campaign. That's been a great way for us to get together. We just have a little bit of time left with those. I also want to thank everyone who has donated to the church financially or with their time. That allows us to continue to do our worship service as well as to offer our food pantry. We are looking at the possibility of opening for live worship at the end of October. And so to that end, we are going to have another workday next Saturday. We're just trying to get prepared. We just had one this past Saturday, and we're trying to get the church ready to go so that we can come back as a church community. Today is a special day because I did an interview with our general minister and president of the United Church of Christ. Some of you might not be aware that our local congregation is part of a national denomination called the United Church of Christ, and I'm ordained in that organization. And it's a wonderful church to be ordained in and be part of, because the UCC has been a unifying church and a church that has been pushing the edges of what it means to love like Jesus here in America for some time. And John's a really great guy. He's from St. Louis. He's going to talk a little bit about just who he is and what he does. He's going to share about a book that he wrote some time ago. And then he's going to talk about a topic that I touched on 2 weeks ago, which is Christian nationalism. And the reason that I reached out to John is that I discovered in my research for this last series that I just did on church and state, that John was a signatory and an endorser of a statement called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And so John's going to talk a little bit about that as well. I'm so glad to introduce John to you and a little bit more about the UCC. And today we got some great music from Jason as well. And in fact, we're going to have one of those songs right after this. Thank you for tuning in today. And if you are new here, we are so glad that you are worshiping with us online. Below in the information section is a link for a new here form. I'd love for you to fill that out. That gets you on our weekly email distribution, as well as it gives me an opportunity to reach out to you, invite you out for some coffee. I love to do that with new people in our church. Thank you so much for being here today.
I sought the Lord, and He answered me and delivered me from every fear. Those who look on Him are radiant. They'll never be ashamed. Never be ashamed. Magnify the Lord with me. Come exalt His name together. Glorify the Lord with me. Come exalt His name forever. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard me and delivered me from my enemies. The Son of God surrounds his saints. He will deliver them. He will deliver them. Magnify the Lord with me. Come exalt his name together. Glorify the Lord with me. Come exalt his name forever. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Oh, blessed are they who hide in him. Oh, fear the Lord. Oh, all you saints, he'll give you everything. He'll give you everything. Magnify the Lord with me. Come exalt his name together. Glorify the Lord with me. Come exalt his name forever.
John Dorhauer, Reverend Dr. John Dorhauer, is our president and our general minister. I'm going to ask him to describe a little bit about himself and what that means, but I do want to point out something unique about the United Church of Christ is we're a congregationalist polity, which means we have great autonomy here in the local church. However, we have accountability and responsibility to the national setting through something we call covenant. And so we're in a covenant relationship with John, and he said yes to my request to interview him. So thank you, John, for being here. And if you could tell us a little bit about who you are and what does it mean to be the general minister and president of the UCC?
I am happy to do that, Scott, and thank you for the invitation. I'll add to what you said about the local church being accountable to the national setting, that in the same covenant relationship, what that means is the national setting is also accountable to your local church. That's the way this works. So I am the general minister and president of the United Church of Christ. The title implies a couple of things and really identifies two roles. So when you think of what I do, think of the title and separate it into the two roles: general minister and president. And on the general minister side, I serve as the primary ecumenical officer of the denomination relating to our ecumenical and interfaith partners. I have opportunity to show up to many of the large celebrations of the wider church, whether those are anniversary celebrations of local churches. I'm scheduled to do a 400th anniversary in early November. I'll do that virtually. I just recently wrote a proclamation for a church's 150th anniversary. I attend a lot of annual meetings, and that's the general minister part. I carry in some ways the theological and liturgical office of the wider church. The president part means that I am the CEO/administrative officer for a national headquarters, which employs about 117 people. and runs about a $21 million budget annually that funds the headquarters and its operations, that funds the programmatic work we do to support local churches, that funds the work that we do to direct the work of associations to oversee ministry and ministers, and also supports global ministries where we have a mission presence in about 90 countries around the world. And so that's the president part. I oversee those operations. And while we're talking about our $20 million budget, let me just say thank you to your local church, because a portion of what you collect in your offerings goes to fund the work of the wider church. And I'm grateful for all of that.
That would be listed as OCWM in our budget.
Our church's wider mission.
Yes, yeah. And you are in Cleveland now?
Cleveland is where the headquarters are. That's correct.
But you're originally from St. Louis.
St. Louis is my hometown, which means I'm a diehard St. Louis Cardinal fan, as I know many folk in Indianapolis are also.
Yeah, we share that in common. I'm more of a Cardinals fan by bloodline. My dad was such a fan that he knew who the high school kids were that they were looking at.
Well,
yeah.
I knew there was something I liked about you, Scott.
Yeah, there you go. At least we got that. You wrote a book some time ago about your experiences as the conference minister in St. Louis. Can you tell us just a little bit about that book?
Yes. So this would have been in the early 2000s. And what we began to experience, not just in the St. Louis Association where I was serving on conference staff, but more broadly across the life of the United Church of Christ, were disruptions in church unity unlike anything we had experienced before. There was an aggressive polarization going on between people with more conservative and people with more progressive or liberal points of view, who heretofore had existed quite peacefully with one another for decades. But now there were disruptions going on, and we couldn't understand what that was about. And when I came onto the staff in Missouri, I was asked first for the Missouri Conference, and then more broadly for the United Church of Christ, because what we were experiencing in the Missouri Mid-South Conference, we were learning other conferences were experiencing. And one of the hardest hit conferences was Indiana, Kentucky. Through this process that we're describing, they lost more churches than any other conference. They were devastated by this. So we began to ask ourselves, what's going on here? What's happening that hadn't been happening before? And something emerged early on in the resource. Whether we were going to visit a rural, isolated congregation, small membership in central Missouri, or a downtown inner city urban church in St. Louis, we were discovering the same printed materials handed out that were all about discrediting the United Church of Christ as an authentic religious organization, calling it heretical and its teachings antithetical to Scripture. And we thought, how is it possible that this humble, salt of the earth farmer in South Central Missouri has the same document making the same argument in his hands that the woman in South St. Louis has in hers? And we began to uncover in setting after setting after setting the circulation of the same materials, and asked ourselves, okay, what's going on here? And without going into a lot of detail, what we ended up discovering is that there were outside agents trained to foment dissent in not just United Churches of Christ, but in any mainline progressive church. That was the second big insight. We thought this was a UCC thing because the United Church of Christ has a reputation for being progressive, one of the most progressive denominations. So we thought there's some pushback for that. But we discovered this was going on in the Methodist Church. This was going on in the Lutheran Church. This was going on in the Episcopal Church. And at the heart of it all was a single organization, known as the IRD, the Institute on Religion and Democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we discovered was this wasn't just members of churches who had been together for decades, all of a sudden waking up and realizing they can't stand each other.
Uh-huh.
They were actually being given materials and trained to foment dissent, to make people angry. And the end game was to so disorient any church with an inclination towards social justice that it would be easier for them to stop fighting for that than to continue, knowing if they continue, it might tear the church apart. And in fact, it tore many churches apart. And it caused many churches just up and leave the United Church of Christ as a result of it.
You
And
know,
the book was simply a way of saying,
Mhm.
this is what's going on.
Mhm.
And this is how you inoculate yourself from any agents who are interested in just tearing apart the unity that you share.
Yeah, yeah. You know, as I was reading your book, which is titled Steeplejacking, which is the term that you all came up with for this process, I'd like to talk with you more about this actually probably off the interview, but here at Faith in the early 2000s, a minister was hired from St. Louis area, and he immediately, there was, I think, some difficulties. I mean, I hear different sides of the story, but it got really tense. I've read some of the annual reports that this guy wrote, and he was very concerned about the UCC's open and inclusive stance on gay marriage. And I have heard that he was making a push to pull us out of the UCC.
I would love to talk with you offline. This is a repeated pattern.
Yeah.
And I'd be willing to bet if you have copies of those reports that I can show you copies of those exact same materials that were circulated in other churches.
Yeah. I mean, the church was worshiping about 120 at that point in time. It had experienced a lot of incremental decline in the 80s and early 90s, but this split it in half. People are still wounded. You know, I still feel like he kind of walks through the halls a little bit, along with our best pastor, which is good to have him, his spirit still here.
So here's an important thing for you and the members of your church to realize. Embracing political and theological differences within a congregation has no effect on the membership. In fact, there are people who are looking for that diversity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Conflict is the single greatest contributor to a church decline and church loss. And people have long been able to hold Bible studies and prayer groups and preach sermons from people with different theological and political orientations without that affecting the membership.
Yeah. I love that you bring that up, because as we've talked, it is a sincere goal of mine as pastor of our community, and I know of many of our leaders, to create a space where whether somebody leans conservative or liberal, that they are welcome in this space, that they don't have to believe the same thing. But there is a standard of how we treat one another and how we deal with conflict.
You talked about early on in our conversation, our congregational polity.
Mm-hmm.
When I interviewed for my second church, the patriarch of that church, whom I didn't identify in the interview as the patriarch, I would learn that about him later, said to me at the end of my interview, "John, you and I are never going to agree on anything." I was a liberal preacher, theologian, and political orientator, and he was the exact opposite. But then he said, "Nobody in this church will fight harder for your right to say what God puts on your heart to say than I will."
Yeah.
And I served that church for 8 years, and he was right. We didn't agree on anything, but he believed in my authority to preach the gospel in the ways of the Holy Spirit. And I didn't abuse that privilege.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't use the pulpit to beat him up for being a political conservative.
Yeah. In my first sermon of this series, the point that I'm looking at to make is that, you know, we can have different viewpoints,
but it's when we actually don't listen to each other. So the story in Luke 9, where the disciples discover they saw somebody casting out demons in Jesus' name, but he wasn't part of our group.
Right.
I keyed in on the fact that they saw him, but they didn't know his name. They never listened to anything. They didn't take time to consider his perspective. Instead, they were immediately suspicious.
Right.
And I think that in our culture right now, in the political landscape, you're on one side of the fence or the other, and we're suspicious of each other and not willing to listen. And that is a context for us to have conflict and for there to be division. And we need to change the way we relate to one another when we differ on things.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there are too many political and cultural role models now who want you to believe that if somebody doesn't hold your political point of view, they're to be feared, if not disdained.
Mm-hmm.
And we're part of a tradition of faith that has, as you've articulated here, said that we embrace you on your journey wherever you are.
Mm-hmm.
And you said you said something like, we can be that kind of church. I would argue you have to be that kind of church. That's what it means to be a part of the body of Christ. No matter who you are, where you are, you're welcome here.
Yeah. It's Jesus chooses a tax collector and a zealot to be part of his 12, right? I mean, they couldn't.
That's
be
right.
Part, right?
There's this wonderful passage in Revelation. It's this obscure passage where John is being taken through the halls of heaven. And there's this conversation where they look in the corner and there's this group and somebody goes, now who are they and how did they get here? And it's that typical reaction, you know? And what we discover is that heaven's open to everybody.
Because of God's grace, you know?
That's right. Yeah. But there's always this reaction. Now, wait a minute. Who are they and how did they get here?
Yeah.
Welcome to the family.
Yeah, they weren't part of our group.
Right.
So I started researching for this series that is finishing with this interview, even though we're doing it before the series began. It's titled Church and State. It's on religion and politics. Yeah. I felt like since we're entering an election and politics is such a heated thing that it was a responsibility as a preacher and leader in a community to try to address that from a faith-based perspective. And in that research, I started coming across a lot of articles on something called Christian nationalism. And then I came across a website called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. I went to see who these people were, and I found you as an endorser of that statement. And that's why I decided to look you up. So would you talk a little bit about what do you understand Christian nationalism to be?
Yeah.
And how it differs, the theology differs from the theology of Jesus, and just kind of whatever else you might say about that.
Sure. So let me talk a little bit about my family roots. I grew up Catholic in St. Louis, by the way. And that's another story for how I ended up the general minister and president of the United Church of Christ after 8 years in a Catholic seminary. But I learned in my early 20s that I'm also a descendant of the Mayflower. My grandmother's name, her maiden name was Howland, Dolores Howland, and I'm a direct descendant of John Howland, who was an indentured servant to the captain on board the Mayflower, and a founding member of that church whose 400th anniversary I should be celebrating in November, Plymouth Congregational Church in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where the Mayflower landed. And they were a part of a group of Congregationalists in England who were being persecuted for their faith. Mm-hmm. Devout Christians, willing to die for their faith and willing to cross an angry ocean in a tiny vessel in order to plant the seeds of faith on a new shore, and in doing so, guarantee that no government would prescribe to them what they could and could not believe. And many Congregationalists were instrumental in building those early governments and in writing those early state constitutions and eventually what would become the Constitution of the United States, and imagining a way of being both people of faith and politically active without having a political agenda prescribed to you your faith.
Mm-hmm.
That's a part of the United Church of Christ's story. Those Congregationalists are one of the four streams that formed the United Church of Christ in 1957 by arguing that our differences in religious belief should never keep us from coming to the table together. And so Christian nationalism is anathema to the way of being church and being Christian that the United Church of Christ espouses. It would be our returning to a government authority that would prescribe, not just for us, but for every citizen in this country, what they could and could not believe and what they morally could choose or not choose to do. That would be so averse to the planting and the seeds that were birthed on this soil that would eventually form the United Church of Christ. And so, am I a devout Christian? Absolutely. Do I believe that the pathway walked by disciples of Jesus is the pathway to eternal life? Absolutely. Do I want my elected governing officials, judges, and legislators branding my Christianity as the law of the land and forcing others to believe that? Absolutely not. I will oppose that with everything in my body and with my entire being.
So you took the opportunity to endorse and be part of this group that is standing against this thing called Christian nationalism.
Yes.
And you see it obviously as a very real threat to our nation and to Christianity in general. I shared with you in the pre-interview that I talked with a neighbor about this who's a well-read individual, and I brought it up and he was like, I've never heard of that, and I don't get it, and I tried to kind of explain it. We haven't defined it yet for the audience here. But could you talk a little bit about like what does it look like, and who would you associate with this?
In its most extreme form, the writings of R.J. Rushdoony define the end game for Christian nationalism. And it's a focus on Old Testament law and morality. And in order, and I mean a literal interpretation of Old Testament law and morality, I know very few active Christians who would argue that the literal application of Old Testament law is the way our Constitution should be written. But that's what R.J. Rushdoony's brand of Christian nationalism is arguing. Mm-hmm. Which means that if you divorce somebody or if you are an adulterer, you're to be put to death. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There are clearly laws written in the Levitical and Deuteronomical code that today we no longer see as normative for us.
Right.
But a true Christian nationalist wants the Constitution of the United States rewritten to reflect Old Testament, not New Testament, Old Testament law. Mm-hmm. And the entire New Testament then must be reinterpreted through the lens of that paradigm. That is a radical understanding. If folk want a quick way into understanding what this is, I highly recommend a book by an investigative journalist, Michelle Goldberg, entitled Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism, which does two things. It describes in great detail what the Christian nationalism is, represents, and wants, but it also lays pretty clear through a very good investigative journalist how close we are to this actually becoming a part of the American landscape.
Mm-hmm. So you had mentioned that R.J. Rushdoony's theology is highly influential at a
Yeah.
specific school at Liberty University.
Liberty University, right.
And Liberty's been in the news a lot lately because
Yep.
their president, Jerry Falwell Jr., has I think been forced to resign at this point.
With a $10.5 million buyout to his
Right.
contract. So let's
Yeah.
not feel too sorry for him.
And so he would be somebody on the national scene. I'm sure you're probably familiar with the Dallas Baptist pastor, Robert Jeffers, who is somebody else who made the news
Yes.
earlier this year with his sermon that America is a Christian nation. He put up the billboards in Dallas that eventually got taken down. And so these, and Franklin Graham is another person that I think is often associated. So these are all people that you would look to as putting forth a view of Christianity that's more rooted in Old Covenant than New Covenant, and a desire to kind of merge that theology into our political sphere.
Correct.
Yeah.
And to contrast that, I've been receiving almost every week now emails from the Biden campaign asking me to endorse Joe Biden as the candidate for president.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way I'm going to do that. I am as politically active and astute as anybody can be. And yet I would never, from the office that I occupy, disclose my political choices.
Mm-hmm.
I will talk about my religious values and how those values compel me to make certain political choices, but I am never going to endorse a candidate. When you see a pastor, especially one with a large audience, not just endorse a candidate, but become intimately connected to that candidate in a public way,
Mm-hmm.
you're seeing an abridgment of the separation of church and state that we in the United Church of Christ hold as sacrosanct. And we think that's a violation of our Christian ethics and responsibilities.
Let me kind of go a little further down that road with you, because I'm now just curious. So I don't know who, but I imagine that President Obama had some religious advisors. And it's something that I've been,
Yeah.
wrestling with, right? Like, is it wrong for a president to have religious advisors, or for somebody to come in and
No.
do that?
In fact, Tracy Blackman, one of the officers of the United Church of Christ, Associate General Minister, was one of the pastors who served on the Faith Advisory Council for the Obama administration.
Mm-hmm.
What I will point out is, if you remember at President Obama's first inauguration, Rick Warren delivered the prayer at his inaugural address.
Mm-hmm.
Rick Warren is as conservative a theologically oriented pastor as we can find in America. He's not a Christian nationalist,
Mm-hmm.
but he is certainly a very conservative. And what President Obama did in building his Faith Advisory Council was make sure that a multiplicity of voices were at the table. In the last week that President Obama held office, I was invited in as one of about a dozen interfaith religious leaders to plead with his staff to take some actions regarding immigration. I can remember Jacob Posner was the rabbi that I was with in that meeting. As we left the White House, we looked at each other and said, we won't be back in this office for 4 years. Meaning that the person about to take office is never going to darken the doors of their hallways with anybody who holds a religious point of view like Jacob Posner for the Reformed Jews did, or I did.
Mm-hmm.
So is it good and wise for a president to have counsel from religious leaders? Absolutely. But it's also important that those voices come to you as the president from a multiplicity of perspectives.
And even as you or Tracy Blackman were in that role, you did not endorse publicly
No.
the president, right?
That's
Yeah.
correct.
Something I had read, or maybe it was from that Andy Stanley talk, but it was around the idea of, as people of faith, we need to keep some distance between ourselves and our elected political officials, because
Right.
the church is to be the moral compass
That's right.
for the country. And if we get to a place where we're not able to say something or stand against something when it's crossed the line, because that's our political party that we favor, we have somehow compromised ourselves.
That's right.
Yeah, in reading about Christian nationalism, it feels like they have crossed that line. And I think the thing that struck me, especially when I was reading your book, Steeplejacking, was a theme is that churches that were being acted upon by this religious, political, outside agency, they mostly were unaware.
Correct.
And in terms of Christian nationalism, its impact and influence on American churches, I think we're mostly unaware.
It's clandestine.
Yeah, and it's also it's so woven into the fabric of kind of our country. Because I thought about how, as a kid, I learned the Pledge of Allegiance before I learned the Beatitudes, or any teaching of Jesus. And I learned from Rocky and Rambo that America was number one, and that sort of thing, far before I learned about how God loves everyone.
It's an interesting cultural phenomenon, because every culture, not just every country, but every culture needs to invest certain shared values in, the next generation coming up. It can be seen on the one hand as a way of controlling behavior. It can also be seen as a way of coaching behaviors that the culture accepts as normative for the common good.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not necessarily a bad thing that at a young age you learn the Pledge of Allegiance. You're learning an identity of what it means to be a citizen of this democracy. And at the same time, as a child, I was learning the Pledge of Allegiance. I was learning the story of the Statue of Liberty. Send to me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be breathe free. And a part of the narrative that we learned early on was that to be America meant to be the place where, if you were being beleaguered and oppressed by a government that didn't grant you your freedom, here's America.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so proud. And so I could stand before that flag with my hand over my heart and pledge allegiance to it, knowing that that aligned with my Christian values.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's important that we sit children down and tell them the story about what it means to be Christian and what it means to be American. What I don't want to see is a government that forces not just Christianity, but a very narrow articulation of the Christian faith as the law of the land. Once that happens, we're not America anymore.
Yeah, yeah. In the series, it is my goal to distinguish between Christian nationalism and the authentic teachings of Jesus. And, a big hook for me on that is that Christian nationalism seems to be rooted in an old covenant theology, and that we are a new covenant church. Jesus announces the new covenant at the Last Supper, and the rest of the New Testament is about that coming into play. And it's something that we have been working with here at our church for quite some time, but this is just kind of another part to it. Question I have is, now that we've talked a little bit about this, what as an average church-going person, would I need to know? What would be helpful? What do I do with this?
So I'm not going to ask a lot here. I've become a Christian minimalist. I contrast it with the 8 years that I spent in Roman Catholic seminary, where my responsibility was to understand literally the letter of the law, all of the doctrinal teachings of the church, and how orienting yourself around these codified beliefs is your pathway to salvation. I have greatly simplified my life as a Christian and reduced my entire theology to what I think are two statements that I will defend. And they don't require any doctrine. God is love and God is just. And the justice that God calls for emanates from the fundamental love that God has for all of God's creation. Every person that God has fashioned in God's image is beloved by God. And so if I were to ask anything of the members of your church, it would be, what does love require of you? Answering that question is the pathway to discipleship. Because all Jesus was about was incarnating and embodying in human flesh the love of God. And everything he did in his mission and ministry and in his messaging was reinforcing what incarnated, embodied love of God looks like and what it acts like. And anybody interested can read about Christian nationalism and dig deeper into what it is and how it manifests itself. But if you really want to respond faithfully to this or any other subject matter in the faith, ask yourself, what does love require of me? And if you're asking yourself if this teaching, if this strict literal interpretation of Old Testament law that wants me to rewrite the Constitution to enact the death penalty against this person who had an extramarital affair, if that feels like what love asks of you, then I invite you to embrace it. But if love requires something else of you, like grace and mercy and forgiveness and compassion, anything short of the death penalty, then please understand that all I'm asking is that you do what love invites you to do, and your heart will tell you what that is.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think of the teaching that Jesus has in Sermon on the Mount, and he says, a tree will be known by the fruit that it bears. A good tree is going to bear good fruit. And so when I think about making my political choices based on what would love require, is it bearing that good fruit? Or is it creating more division? Is it creating more pain? And those are hard things. And, I think we both agree that in our roles as ministers, that it's not our place to tell somebody what policies to choose or what politicians to vote for.
Yep.
It is most certainly our place to lift up Jesus and what he has to say.
Yeah.
How he treated people who were perceived as enemies or as others, and call our people to walk closer to him, no matter whether they're Democrat or Republican.
That's right.
Yeah. Christian first.
Christian first.
Yeah.
Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Jason. I'm the worship leader here at Faith. We're just going to sing some songs together here before we get our service started. And today, we have words on the screen for the songs. They're a screen on your screen, a screen inside a screen. So anyways, we hope you're having a great week and join along and sing with us.
Love, you bring light to the darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord, breath in our lungs. So we pour out our praise, we pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs. So we pour out our praise to you only. Great are you, Lord. You give life, you are love, you bring light to the darkness. You give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath. It's your breath in our lungs. So we pour out our praise, we pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs. So we pour out our praise to you only. Great are you, Lord. And all the earth, and all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. Sing that again. And all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. Sing that chorus one last time. It's your breath. It's your breath in our lungs. So we pour out our praise, we pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs. So we pour out our praise to you only. Great are you, Lord. One last time. Great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord.
Friends, thanks so much for joining us this morning here at Faith UCC. If you're new here, we just want to invite you to go ahead and fill out the New Here form right below. And don't forget to leave a like, leave a comment down below, and just interact with your church family. I'd like to offer us just a blessing as we all say the Lord's Prayer here together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. We'll see you next week.